Roma are the largest minority within the European Union context, and in Europe in general. There are more Roma than Danish or Swedish nationals in Europe, just to give you an example of how the size of the population. But they are spread in most European member states. So there haven't a concentration in one specific state. They are a minority everywhere. The Roma have been in Europe for hundreds of years, so they are autochthonous minorities in many ways. However, very often they are constructed as others, as internal others, as the inner enemy in many cases. It's very interesting to observe how the othering of Roma or other minorities can be very much dated back to the time when in the context of Europe, and the nation state where we've been formed and born, so we're talking about the 19th century. So at the time in which the European nation were constructed as coherent, in some cases homogeneous, or they were imagined as homogeneous, you have this group that were not speaking the language, they were probably live in slightly different ways of intent or in temporary accommodation, which were constructed as other to this idealized image of the nation. In some cases, countries like Italy, which were very weak geopolitically, they didn't have the strength to construct an enemy from outside because it would have been too dangerous. So the Roma served a fairly easy to manipulate a scapegoat for this national identity that needed to be built and constructed at the time. When we look at the Roma, in terms of their legal status in the context of Europe, you have three main categories that may be useful to think about. One are the Roma nationals, so the Roma that have a passport in their country of residence. So in this case, you will have the Manouche group in France, you have, or in Germany as well. Then you have groups like the Romanian Roma that travel extensively in other European member states. So in this case, they are European citizens that exercise their rights to freedom of movement. And the third group is made of the non-EU nationals. They are often from former Yugoslavia, so in many cases they would be refugees from the dissolution of Yugoslavia. So before, for example, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, in Roma, because we're included in the constitution, they were basically included in the quota system in some cases, in which they were allocated more middle-class jobs. So they became more educated, they were included in the education system. And so you have a journalist, you have politicians, you have NGOs, you have a middle-class Romani elite that developed over that period of time. And many of them, or they're sort of the next generation of them, still play a role nowadays in the Romani political movement at European level. But the time in which Yugoslavia break up and the new states were formed, these new states, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, they were not as keen as Yugoslavia to give them the nationality of the new country they were born. They were, in a sense, they used the breakup as a way of getting rid of them. If you look at other countries, like Spain is the other case, which is very interesting with the Gitanos communities. They have been living in Spain for hundreds of years, and in some areas, in particular in the south, in the area of Granada, and they've become almost incorporated in the cultural imaginary of the country, with the flamenco, for example. You know, it's a Gitano style of music, of dance, but it's also assumed as being Spanish. And you could say that you have in some areas that basically they are fully integrated. Still, you will have an area of marginality, but they are much better integrated than most other countries. In many countries, you will hear this sort of idea, these stereotypes that the Roma don't like education and they don't want to work, and this is why a way of. In some cases, it may be true for some, but the way these stereotypes work is mostly as a way of self-justifying the exclusion of some groups. So I don't need to put any effort to promote their integration because of their culture, they don't want to go to school. And I've done work in Italy, for example, with some local authorities that they were relocating Roma groups far away from each other at the very margin of Rome, for example, in areas which were kilometers away from the closest school. And then they were providing some kind of school bus service. And the kids every day were arriving at school 2 hours after the starting time of the class. there are reasons why there is sort of, we are in the position we are now, and is not only or not at all linked to cultural justification. In a way, the fact of living in camps and encampments, which is actually true only for a minority of the Roma, but the one that are more visible in a sense, has always been, on one hand, a form of discrimination on the part of the city of residence or the state of residence. The idea we build camps because so they stay together and they're out of the way. On the other hand, the camps, a space like encampment, become a place where they can construct a network of relationship. They can basically build their own economies. They can basically survive at the margin of the rules of society as well in terms of the expectation. I'm thinking about collecting scrap metal. The camp become a space where it's possible to be appropriated by the communities at the margin and build their own strategies of survival on the basis of this marginality. This doesn't mean that we need to keep them, or in the sense that the idea would be to promote a more equal society in which people have a range of opportunities and then they can sort of choose what to do. Very often the economies that we see developing in space like camps is survival economics. It's the lack of everything else available that lead people to live that way. If you think in terms of the language that the Romani communities use, there are very significant variations. There has been an attempt since the 1970s to harmonize the languages in one sort of language. In reality, if you go to talk to real people on the street, in the camps, in the houses, this diversity is still very much there. And often people cannot really communicate to each other. Just to give you an example, if you have people from Kosovo that speak Romani, and some Calderache from Romania, they won't be able to talk to each other. So it's not the language that brings things together. So what it is? And this is partly why within the debate on people who work with Roma, there is a discussion between, to what extent this minority is the result of the marginalization of a generation, a century, or a specific group of the population that were at the margin of society or the margin of the city, that then became a group. So it's almost a kind of a culture of poverty kind of story. Or is a group which is much more historically rooted in a specific migration that came from the north of India, of specific groups that then spread as a diaspora over different countries and they stopped at a different point for different lengths of time, a longer route that took them to Europe. And the variation in the language is due to the fact that some groups stayed for 200 years in Yugoslavia or under the Ottoman Empire, and others instead went farther and went north and they traveled to Europe. I also think it's important to when we think about what the Roma brings to society is also the fact that they are part of society. So in a sense, society is also the Roma, so it's not something that you add into it. In many places, the Roma have lived as a communities in some of the countries before the country was even born.